All right. Well, we'll probably have a few more people join here as we get rolling, but for the purposes of your schedule and time, we will go ahead and get started. So, welcome everybody. Hope you're having a great week, and school's wrapping up. I know for a lot of you as we're going into summertime, and we're excited to host the last of our industry expert series for the spring session. So, this is the fourth that we've conducted so far. All these, by the way, will be recorded and something you could access on the RAD Navigator. But we're really excited about today's session and the content that we can share with you. So just to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about data governance in Salesforce. So we'll talk about the agenda here in a second. So I'm going to introduce myself and then let Paul, who is co-hosting today, talk and introduce himself as well. So my name is Matt Palmer. I'm the Director of Client Services here at Enrollment RX. I've been here just over 5 years. I've met many of you, and if I haven't, it's nice to meet you remotely. I do work out in the West Coast on Oregon, in the sunny part, at least the southern part of Oregon. And I'm really excited about today's topic. It's something that I've actually been certified in, so is Paul. Salesforce has a certification on sharing and visibility architecture. And that's not necessarily an accessibility thing from like a screen reader or something, but more of how can you silo and share records within Salesforce? And that's really going to be the gist of today's topic. And so with that, Paul has been a compadre with me for a long time, all 5 years I've been here. One of the smartest guys I know when it comes to the Salesforce platform, and he's going to bring a lot of valuable insight to today's session. So with that, I'll let you, Paul, kind of introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Matt. I love the compliments. As you said, my name is Paul Chacon. I'm a senior implementation consultant here, who's also been certified with the data architecture certification. I've been here for about 8 years. Been here every year Matt's been along, and I'm located out in the Midwest, out in Chicago. So I'm also looking forward to going through this presentation with everyone here.
Excellent. And as we go into the session today, just a few kind of reminders. We will post Q&A. So as we go through the session, there's a Q&A chat box that you can use to type questions in, and we will carve out time to answer those both during the presentation and then at the end. So please use that, not the general chat. And then the second piece is we will have a bit of a survey that will pop up right at the end. That really helps us. We read every comment just to make sure we're continuing to provide you the best content we can and follow up with you accordingly. So with that, let's go ahead and kind of go to our next kind of topic here, which is our agenda for today. So really today is all about how can you restrict and how can you silo record visibility within Salesforce. And as higher education institutions, you might have many use cases where there might be a different department, or there might be a different use case where different kind of functionalities within Salesforce are operating, and you want to kind of make sure you're restricting or hiding data that maybe somebody else shouldn't see, right? As far as internal users. And Salesforce is very robust when it comes to these sharing mechanisms, and that's really going to be kind of the foundation of what we talk about through the webinar today. And so we're going to talk about those controlling mechanisms. We're going to talk about ownership of records in Salesforce. We're going to talk about something called roles and hierarchy. Implementing this product for 5+ years, I think roles are probably one of the most neglected things that I see when it comes to institutions. And it's something like, oh, it's not a big deal, it's just a role. Well, it can have some big implications. So hopefully as a takeaway to today's conversation, that's something that could be reevaluated. We're going to talk about what a default sharing model within Salesforce is, what is called org-wide defaults. We're going to talk about sharing rules. So how can you share records if your defaults are set to private? We're going to talk about profiles, which are associated to user records and how those can control records. We're going to talk about page level controls. So if you were with our first industry expert series, we talked about how the new UI for a lot of these pages, especially in Lightning, can have more robust controls to control what a user can see. And then finally, there's a new feature as of 2 releases ago with Salesforce called Restriction Rules. And if you haven't used Restriction Rules yet, which wouldn't surprise me because they're pretty new, we're going to kind of just cover a few use cases with that and a few considerations, as that's a new tool in the arsenal of being able to work with record sharing. And finally, we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So again, use that Q&A box as we go through. But with that, Paul, I'll let you kind of take it away.
Thanks, Matt. So our first topic is on understanding record visibility in Salesforce. A record represents a single instance of data in your system. For example, a contact record for Matt Palmer. This record can contain any amount of information, whether it's biographical information or demographical information. A record can store it all. And since Salesforce is a relational database, that contact record can have other records associated to it, such as an application record, an official test score, and so on. Salesforce provides native tools to either silo or make records public in your environment. This level of access can be controlled for internal users as well as external users. This allows for users within the same organization to either have full, limited, or no access to records, even if the data lives on the same object. An example of this could be having two separate partner. An example of this could be having to separate partner contacts for B2B purposes from your applicant contacts. Counselors would need the ability to view and potentially edit student contact records, but at the same time, the partner contact should remain hidden from them, and they shouldn't be able to see it even though it lives on the same contact object. Let's quickly talk about the concept of ownership. Record ownership is at the core of Salesforce record access capabilities, which allows you to specify which users or types of users should be able to access specific records or types of records. Because of this, it's important to have the right user own the record. Having the correct owner in your organization will allow you to make the most of features like the role hierarchy and sharing rules. And this is where tools like Enrollment RX's Assignment Manager become so powerful and useful alongside these features. Here's a visualization of how we can use Salesforce sharing architecture to restrict record access to your users and how data can be shared to the appropriate members. Configuring the proper organization-wide defaults based on your needs sets the baseline level of access for all of your data. Once that baseline's been established, a well-configured role hierarchy can expand that access to the appropriate users based on the owner of the record. And you can go beyond that with sharing rules to extend it even further beyond what's already being granted by the role hierarchy. And if your organization is making use of account teams and enterprise territory management or territory hierarchy, these features can also grant additional access for records on the account, opportunity, or on the case object as well. The role hierarchy is a powerful organizational tool to establish how records should be shared to your users based on their roles. And like Matt mentioned, this is one of the more neglected ones. So I felt like this is one of the more powerful takeaways when it comes to data governance is the sharing side of the environment. So users higher in the hierarchy gain access to all of the data that's shared to users directly below them in the hierarchy. Each role in the role hierarchy represents a level of data access that a user or group of user needs. So we can look at an example on the next slide as well. So here we're looking at an example of a 4-tier role hierarchy. At the top, we have our director, and directly below that director are 2 associate directors, one managing the Western territories and one managing the Eastern territories. Within the Western territories, we can drill down further to another role that separates the Northwest territories from the Southwest territories. And finally, under those regional coordinators, we see the Southwest coordinators and the Northwest coordinators. Before we start talking about how contact records are shared here, let's quickly cover default sharing settings, or also known as organization-wide defaults and sharing rules. In the sharing settings or organization-wide defaults, we have the capability to configure the default level of access for both internal users as well as external users. Typically, there are 3 options for setting that level of access. Private, and this is the strictest level of access where only the users that own the record will have access to that record, not considering profiles at this moment. Public read only is another option where this gives the viewing of records available to all users, or public read write. This grants all users the ability to view and edit a record regardless of the owner of the record. There are other options that can display depending on which object you're configuring, whether it's a standard or custom object, and how that object relates to other objects. So for example, if a custom object has a master detail relationship to another object, you'd see a 4th option in the sharing setting called controlled by parent. This means that sharing access in this object is granted by the parent's object. Another example for this would be the contact object, where you can have the account control the sharing of the contact record. Circling back to the role hierarchy example we viewed earlier, in order for a role hierarchy to be effective, we need to properly configure our baseline level of access for a contact object. We will set our contact access levels to private in the sharing model for the purposes of this example here. So with contacts now being set to private, we can look at how that would impact members of the role hierarchy. So in our example here, all records that are owned by the coordinators directly under the Northwest Regional Coordinator will be shared to that regional coordinator. And users in the Southwest Regional Coordinator, whether it's the coordinator or the regional coordinator, they will not have access to those records owned from the Northwest side. And then all the users on the Eastern side below the Eastern Associate Director will have no access to those records either. And that's because of our role hierarchy paired with the sharing rule of contacts, or a sharing setting of contacts being private. Because in our example, the contact sharing model is set to private, coordinators within that Northwestern region will not be able to see each other's records either, since they are separate owners in a lateral role hierarchy. So that's where sharing rules come into play. Let's say all the contact records owned by coordinators in the Northwest need the ability to see each other's contact records. That's where we can create a sharing rule where we can grant read access based on the record owner. So that way coordinators, all the coordinators in the Northwest region will be able to see each other's contacts and still not be able to see contacts owned by the Southwest region or Southeast or Northeast region. Matt, can you jump 2 slides ahead, please? Before we dive further into sharing rules, I just wanted to talk to the notion of grant access using hierarchies. This feature controls whether a custom object typically will use the role hierarchy to automatically share records based on the role hierarchy. This setting by default is active for all standard objects, I believe, including contact, but can be disabled for custom objects in the sharing setting page. This is especially powerful if additional objects that have to relate to some of your standard objects that don't exactly fit your role hierarchy model need to be shared by other means, such as sharing rules. Sharing rules can be leveraged to extend access any further beyond the access already granted by the role hierarchy. Sharing rules can be built off the record owner, or they can be built off criteria within the object to share with. If you're using owner-based sharing rules, you can use either a public group, a queue, or role to share with either a public group or a role, with or without their subordinates. And it's similar with a criteria-based sharing rule. instead of selecting which group, queue, or role you want to use as your criteria, you define actual criteria to define which records should be shared and to whom should they be shared to. So one other thing I wanted to mention was the notion of guest user access in sharing rules. So I believe it was back in like 2020 when Salesforce introduced the sharing setting. And on the sharing settings, there was a feature called Secure Guest User Record Access, which enabled site guest users, or which prevented site guest users from being an external user to be granted access through the sharing setting. So with that now being active for all orgs moving forward, there's a third option in the sharing rule configuration page called guest user access based on criteria. And these guest users are used pretty commonly in most of our orgs for either site pages or community pages where you have to register. So think of like the applicant portal registration or an RFI form or recommendation form that's used through Form Builder RX. These pages use a site guest user to interact with your system. These types of sharing rules are important for getting your various forms or your portal registration pages to function properly. And that's why it's such a big deal that we set these up. And it's also available in our RAD Navigator on our help site for Form Builder RX.
Great, thanks, Paul. Yeah, and just to echo this, this is something where we do have a link to this in our deck that we'll share here, but any public-facing site that you set up using our products will require some configuration of guest user sharing rules. And so that's something you may have done or may not have done if you're not an admin, but again, we have lots of content here, but that's something good just to be aware of. So we're going to talk about a scenario. So Paul was kind of talking about kind of the siloing based on, role hierarchies. So we're going to talk about a scenario and do a little demo here. So the scenario we have is the director of grad programs wants to ensure that all users in the Masters of Divinity can see any applications related to the Masters of Theology. So the application org-wide default is set to private. So currently they can only see applications that they have ownership of. So basically these two departments, even though they're somewhat similar, they can't see each other's applications based on their org-wide defaults. And so as a system admin, how could you resolve that issue, right? So let's kind of jump into a demo here into an org and kind of talk through this for a few minutes. So let me just exit here. All right, so in this scenario, let's start with the application record. So this is an application record that lives within Salesforce. This applicant is part of the theology department. And you can see here that it's owned by a particular user. And this particular user is part of the theology role hierarchy, right? So in that role hierarchy, he's part of that theology department. But the divinity school doesn't have the ability to see this record, right? So if I were to go to sharing settings by clicking the setup icon here, and some of this is going to kind of highlight what Paul was showing earlier. And in setup, I type in sharing. I'll navigate to what's called sharing settings. And within sharing settings, the organizational wide defaults that Paul was referring to are shown here at the top. So before we go into our example here, just to talk to a few things. So the first one, as he mentioned here, was, is it public, read, write, transfer, internal, like it is for a lead, and then external would be for, again, like communities and things of that nature. But you can also see certain items are controlled by the parent. That's because the relationship between the two objects is what's called a master detail. The most common example of that is an account record with a contact. So these are out of the box standard objects that are provided by Salesforce. And you can see there's a checkbox here that says grant using hierarchies. And all that means is that within that role hierarchy, anybody below, so if I'm a director and I have, people below me in the role hierarchy, all those records below me, I can see by default, right? No matter what the kind of hierarchy is. So if I want to go through and look at this example, application, so here are our standard fields, but up here I can go to find those. And the way this is kind of organized is a little funky, where it starts with your standard objects, and then you go down and it kind of starts over alphabetically with your custom objects. But if I go to the application object, which is what we're discussing today, this will show you the settings for this particular object. So in this case, you can see that the organizational wide defaults for this is set to private, which means that unless there's some sort of override, it won't show across different departments, right? So there are some things that can override this, however, and we'll talk about that towards the end of our presentation today. But you see down here, and these are what are called profiles related to the application. So there are object level permissions and there's organizational wide permissions. And this is something, if you are a admin of your org, that's probably a good thing to check up on, because anybody that has this profile of view all data and modify all data means that no matter what your sharing rules are set to, right, if it's set to private, this overrides everything. They can see everything and they can do everything. So especially when it comes to your org-wide defaults, you want to be pretty selective on who has these permissions of view all data and modify all data, because these are kind of like the two settings that no matter kind of what restrictions you have, the user can pretty much do anything. So you do want to be very careful. And then in addition to that, there is the same kind of setting, but it's specific to an object. So in this case, it's not all objects, it's just specific to this application object. So that is something just to think about as you think about the profile and whether or not, this would kind of be set up here. So I've already kind of set this up here as far as the sharing rule, but let's kind of just talk about this. So in here, if I were to click new and create a new sharing rule, I have some options here and I'll show you what has been configured, but I can do it based on a record owner. So if I'm part of group A versus group B, or I can do it based on criteria. So perhaps there's a field on the application where like program code of all the theology programs is X, right? So if you do something like, you pick that sort of code or something related to that. Let's see if there's a program code here. I don't know if there is, but that's a common example. But essentially any field on the application can be used as what's called criteria-based record sharing, right? So if it's this type of record, I could do it in this way. In the example that we're using here, we're going to share across role hierarchy. So the Master of Divinity group and the Master of Theology group are siloed in the role hierarchy. So what I want to do is to create a sharing rule to bridge that gap. So I'm going to hit cancel here and show you the one that has been created. So if I go down here and I click edit, let's see. So what you can see here is that the Master of Divinity, so any application owned by the Masters of Divinity, share with the role of Masters of Theology. And what you can see here is I can also control the level of access. So if I only want a read-only scenario here where they can see the record only, but not actually edit the record, that's where this access level of read-only would be applied. But if I want them to also be able to access and edit the record as well, I can change this to be read-write. So that's just a quick demo and solution there, where if you have two kind of siloed departments and you need to create what's called an internal sharing rule, that could be applied in that scenario. So continuing on here, Paul, if you want to talk a little bit about profiles and permissions now.
Sure. Yeah, so in addition to being able to control which records a user can see or access, Salesforce has mechanisms in place to control what fields of information can be seen or edited on a given record if you've been granted access. And as Matt mentioned, there are profile settings that can override the default sharing setting that's been set either through the org-wide defaults, the sharing rules created, or role hierarchy. A profile can also give view all or modify all, as you mentioned. But with profiles, you get controls for a lot of different things, and there's an incredibly granular level of control for those profiles as well and those settings. So you can control which apps users can see based on profile. You can use which tabs, or if you're using Lightning, which items are visible in your app launcher tab in the upper left corner. You can control which administrative permissions a profile will have, or user permissions, and object and field level permissions can be controlled as well. And you can even control session settings as well as password policies, all from the profile. So where organization-wide defaults, sharing rules, and role hierarchy control what records within an object you can access, profile controls what data can be accessed and manipulated within those records, if at all. Object level permissions are used to determine what actions can be performed on an object. If a profile doesn't grant your user read access to an object, it doesn't matter what records the sharing model grants you. You don't have the permissions to view any record on that object at all. Object level permissions can grant 4 different capabilities: read, create, edit, and delete, or CRUD for short. And field level permissions let you designate which fields can be viewed and which fields can be updated for a given user, further adding more security to the data that they're accessing. Where sharing rules help extend the sharing model of the organization-wide defaults and the role hierarchy, permission sets and permission set groups also help extend the permissions the profile grants. So a permission set allows you to grant additional levels of access to specific users. And this is an incredibly useful tool when needed to grant permissions for a select few users within a profile. So a profile will add all the permissions to all the users that are assigned that profile, but with a permission set, you can select a select few of those profile members to have additional access on top of the permission, on top of the profile. And you can even use that permission set across different profiles as well. Permission set groups is a nifty tool as well, because it lets you bundle various different permission sets to streamline and assign and manage permission sets more easily for different users or different job functions within your organization. Along with the permission set group comes the ability to apply muting permissions, which is only available to a permission set group. And that lets you remove individual permissions from that permission set group, allowing you to have even more customizability within your org. So I just wanted to note that if you create a muting rule within a permission set group, that only applies to that permission set group. That is to say that if you're using those permission sets within that group in other areas or in other groups, those muting permissions don't carry over to those other uses of that permission set. It only applies to the users using that permission set group. And then I did just want to circle back to what Matt brought up on the view all and modify all permissions. We just wanted to give that its own slide so that we can talk about that specifically, because those are pretty powerful features or permissions within the profile, which will override the sharing rules and the modify or view and edit access of fields or objects. So that's something that you just want to be mindful of, whether you're doing it within a profile, a permission set group. You always just want to be mindful who has those levels of access. And another item I wanted to note was the view all lookup record names, which I think Matt can show when he's going through another demo. If a user doesn't have access to a specific object that is related to your contact or application, for example, let's say like accounts for academic programs using the EDA model, This feature here lets them at least view the record of the name within that looked up field, even though they don't have access to those records themselves. This will at least let them see what is being populated on a given academic program field or any other lookups that they don't have access to that object for.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paul. So we're going to go into another scenario now. So kind of talking a little bit about what Paul just mentioned. So the director of admissions wants to restrict access to a custom financial aid object to anyone with a recruitment profile. They want to ensure that the award information and sensitive details about the applicant isn't available to any admissions recruiters. So how could this be accomplished? So let's jump back into our org here. All right, so talking about that scenario there where we're wanting to look at the financial aid object. So let's talk about that for a second. So in this scenario, we have an application, Sarah Science, and you can see here that there's a custom object that was created. So an object is just a data table that relates right to this application. So as in my case, as a system administrator, I can see that they have a financial aid record. That financial aid record has an award amount and an award year, right? So this isn't really as much about sharing rules because I'm not trying to necessarily silo, right, one type of financial aid record versus a different one. You know, that would be more in the case of sharing rule. In this scenario, I'm wanting to just hide this essentially from certain types of users, right? Because we want to protect sensitive data for certain types of profiles. So the way that can be done is if I go to the profile tab, so over here in profiles, and I look at the recruitment profile, okay, so this is the recruitment profile that I want to use to restrict. Some of the things that Paul talks about, I'm going to just highlight here a little bit. So the first thing in this UI that I'm going to do is I'm going to click edit, this edit button. When I do that, the UI changes a little bit. And so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. So a couple of things I just want to highlight on my way down here is that the administrative permissions, as well as the general user permissions, are where those kind of default overrides live. So to give you an example, we talked about the view all data, which I believe is, let's see, view all data right here. So here we have view all data, right? And then view all users. And you can see it's highlighted here. So that kind of overriding permission we talked about at a global level for a profile, that's where that lives. By the way, just as a quick tip, what I do typically on this page is just a Control F if I'm trying to find a word, and I'll jump down because there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason to how some of this is organized by Salesforce. But that is one. The other one is the manage all data. So if I go up here to manage, and let's see, so manage passwords, it'll be over here, I think, and manage all data. But again, that's where those two things would live. So as I continue to go down, though, beyond the global settings, we have what are called, what Paul was referring to as the CRUD settings, where you can essentially at an object level control what a specific profile can see, but not only what they can see, what they can do, right? And so in the example that we have here, the way that Salesforce does this is they group it by standard object permissions first, always. Okay, so these are out of the box. So a contact object would be out of the box, for example. But then down below, you have your custom object permissions, okay? And again, this is sorted alphabetically going down and then down this way. And so the financial aid object that we were just talking about, which we have here. So I want to go down to financial aid. You can see here that they have view all access to everything related to the financial aid object. So as a admissions director or as a system admin, you can kind of take one of two approaches. If you wanted to grant them access to the financial aid object, but just hide certain fields, that could be done on what's called field level security. on the same kind of profile page where certain fields just could be hidden. So that is one option. But the other option, if you just want to hide the object altogether, is in this example, is I would simply uncheck all the boxes related to the financial aid object. So now they can't have any access to this related to this profile. And I'm going to go up to the top. I'm going to go ahead and save my changes. Okay. So now if you're wondering, all right, well, I made this change for the recruiters, but who are my recruiters? I mean, I have so many users, I'm trying to remember. Well, the nice thing is Salesforce provides you this view users kind of tab here. And in this case, you have Brenda Business. So what I'm going to do, and by the way, this is a really helpful tool as an admin, where you can log in as a different user and just make sure that the permissions are working as expected. So in this example, right, we have Sarah Science's record. So I'm logged in as my profile right now. The application where we have this financial aid. So it's 16673. So if I now go to this profile and I log in, you'll see now that it's going to say I'm logged in as Brenda Business. And now I can search for Sarah Science. So here's my Sarah Science. You can also type that in if it didn't pop up. And I'm going to go to the application. And I think it was this Master of Divinity one. And you notice, even though it's the same app record, right, 16673, the financial aid related list doesn't show at all. So that is because we hit it at a profile level. So I didn't have to do anything with the page layout. I didn't have to do anything, related to that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But everything that we restricted there was at a profile level. So again, we wanted to kind of just talk about the difference between kind of that lateral sharing with sharing rules, where you're taking the same object and siloing it and then sharing across that. But also, if you have kind of the ability to restrict visibility to records or fields altogether, and that can be done through a profile. And so that's the example there where that could be restricted. So I'm going to log out as Brenda and go back here. So if I go back to our demo here, or our next slide, just pull this up. So the next topic we want to talk about is encrypted data. So what we're talking about today is standard encryption. So Salesforce out of the box provides some standard encryption mechanisms with encrypted text fields as an example. The most common example for higher ed institutions with this would be, Social Security as an example would be an encrypted field. Any kind of personally identified information. Now, I'm not going to go real deep into this, but just something I mentioned, Salesforce also provides something called Shield, which is actually like a product they provide. It has more robust encryption of lots of data. And that's something, you can engage with them on. But that's the second type that has more robust internal encryption of most of your data, including in Sandbox and things like that. But what we're talking about today is just the encrypted text field and kind of what's involved with that. So one thing I just want to mention here is that if you have, let's use the example of an encrypted field for Social Security. If that encrypted field is on your page layout, and in the encryption for Social Security just shows the last 4 digits as an example, something just to be aware of is that even if a user can't see that field, they can still go in and edit it if they have permission. So even if they don't have this view encrypted field permission, which I'll talk about here in a second, that still technically can be edited or deleted by an end user. So I would just make sure as a best practice that that field, that Social Security field that you're using, does not have edit access from just about all your users if possible. So I just definitely would want to make sure you're aware of that, or hide it from the page altogether. But that's just something just to be aware of. So we're going to talk about a scenario here that comes up pretty common. So the IT director wants to ensure that the Social Security, so any Social Security number in Salesforce cannot be viewed by anyone other than users that are designated to be able to see it, right? And so I'm going to talk through the solution here, and then I'm going to show it a little bit as well. So the first step you would do is, as a system administrator, you would do an audit to make sure that the field being used for SSN type is the type of encrypted, right? So it's actually a field type. So Salesforce field type would be like a text or a Boolean or a pick list. Those are what are called field types in Salesforce. Text encrypted is actually a field type. So essentially what we'd want to do in that scenario is remove that kind of permission from profiles and then create a permission set called view encrypted data, so that only specified users can view that at all, if anybody should, right? And then assign that permission set to a specific user. So just as a reminder, the difference between a profile and permission set is, yeah, you can remove it from a profile or add it to a profile, but a permission set is more global, where you can be more restrictive on a profile, and then you can encompass several different profiles to add those users to a permission set. So in this case, that's the approach I would take. And then finally, audit all profiles to ensure that the view encrypted data isn't enabled where it shouldn't be. And then also, as I mentioned, consider updating field level security of the encrypted field for profiles that shouldn't edit it. Because again, if you can view it, you can still edit it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to jump back to our org, and I'm going to go back to our contact record. So Sarah Science is our contact. And if I scroll down here, the social security number, as you can see here, I can fully see, right? Not only can I fully see it, I can fully edit it. And so the scenario here that we want to just be aware of is, all right, well, what governs this and what is the permission related to this? So I'm my user account, which is here, which is Debbie Director, has a profile that will be able to see this. So I'm going to go to my setup menu, and I've set this up already, but just to kind of walk you through the permissions and why I can see it is under profiles. Sorry, permission sets. So here are the permission sets that are here, and I created one. I believe that should be here, called view encrypted data, which is right here. So if I go to this permission set, what you can see here is that under system permissions, which is right here, we grant the ability, only has one thing checked here. That's all that controls right here. That says view encrypted data. That's what controls the actual viewing of encrypted fields. And this also lives on a profile as well. But again, we're making this declarative to add a specific user to it. So if I want to manage the assignments to this user, right now you can see that Debbie Director, which is my account, can fully see it. And if I did not want that, right? So let's just remove Debbie for example. So that's been done. So now if I go back to my contact record, what you'll be able to see is if I refresh this, you can see that now it's encrypted, right? So the first, the encryption type of this type, and there are different encryption types you can employ, just shows the last 4 digits. But what I was mentioning before is that even though it's encrypted to me, if I have access to edit this, I could, go like this and save it, and I wouldn't get any error or anything. Now I've just messed up their SSN. So that's what I'm saying, where you just want to be really cautious, where you want to make sure that this has limited either visibility on the page overall, or that you're on a field level security. So just to talk about that real quick and how you would go about that, if I go to profiles here and I scroll down to field level security. So right now, so this is field level security for your objects. And so this lives on the contact. And so if I go down to contact and I click view, here I can click edit. And if it was SSN, right? So right here, SSN, text encrypted. I could either make this read only, right, where they'd see encrypted, or if I remove both of these, that user with this profile would not be able to access or edit. So that's how you would update that via essentially field level security. So that's another mechanism that you can use to get more granular in that scenario. All right, so let's talk a little bit more now about another scenario. So let's go to back to our slides here. So we talked about the solution of hiding our SSN. So let's talk about a new feature that Salesforce has introduced 2 kind of releases ago, and it's called restriction rules. So up until this point, everything in the Salesforce sharing model was starting at the most restrictive and then just opening up, right? It never went the reverse direction where you could say restrict access versus, just have a restrictive profile and grant more access, right? But they actually changed that a little bit in what's called restriction rules. And this is something that came out, I believe 2 releases ago by Salesforce. And so there are some things to be aware of with restriction rules. Definitely would be something I would test in a sandbox or just kind of explore. And that we'll link in our slide deck some resources to it as well. But essentially, it's defined on an object manager, right? So a specific object, and it's only available for custom objects, contracts, tasks, and events. So like this would not be available, for example, for a contact or an account. There is limitations based on the license type and the whether you're enterprise or performance, it's the version of Salesforce you're on. And the big one that was kind of highlighted in the guide by Salesforce is that Salesforce Classic must actually be disabled before enacting these. Most orgs I know still use Salesforce Classic to some degree, so this might be a non sequitur. But with that, I think it is a unique enough feature to at least highlight and make you aware of. So let's just talk a little bit about before restriction rules, kind of, again, what was in place. So the baseline object permissions, right? So organizational wide defaults that we talked about, where we showed you that list in that sharing kind of setting page. That's the base level of access, right? So in our example earlier, applications were set to private. So that's the base level. So from there, you have mechanisms to open up that access. So role hierarchy, which we talked about earlier with Paul, where somebody above you in the role hierarchy can now see records inherently from people below them. Sharing rules, right? We created a manual sharing rule together based on ownership across different hierarchies. Again, you can also use that based on criteria. And then there's also an ability, they actually just added this button to Lightning. For a long time, it was only in Classic. But if you have the permission, you can what's called manually share a record. So if you're on like a contact record that your fellow user does not have access to, you can manually share just that single record with somebody. And that's what's called manual sharing. Now, once restriction rules kind of are now in play, this is the difference. So it's the same baseline kind of hierarchy here, but now you have this kind of extra layer here that's basically hidden records outside the criteria. So this top blue line here allows you to restrict what records are within each one of these buckets, which is a fairly new concept to Salesforce functionality overall. So we'll talk about that in a scenario here in just in a minute. But that is something that I think is unique enough to kind of highlight. So the other kind of major control that we have is page layout controls. So you can control, the ability to hide fields, not only on that field level security that we just talked about with social security, but you could even just remove it from the page altogether. So that is one powerful tool you have. If you were able to join our first session that we had for industry experts, we were talking about what's called dynamic forms, which is a pretty confusing term. Basically, it's a new way to control details of a page layout in a more dynamic way. And so we're going to talk about an example of that as well. That in the new Salesforce release upcoming here, I believe in a couple of weeks, will be available dynamic forms for standard objects in addition to what right now is just custom objects. So custom objects right now we can do on the application, but like right now you can't use dynamic forms on a contact record, for example, but that's coming down the pike. So page layout controls is another way you can kind of control visibility to specific fields that might live on a record. Okay. So we're going to talk about this page layout field control in a scenario, and then the final scenario we're going to have is talking about the restriction rules. So in this scenario, the graduate director does not want to see any application field related to the review process on the page layout until the applicant is in the status of review. So how can this be accomplished? So using traditional page layouts and such, this actually can't be accomplished. Let me pull this up here. My slide deck closed here for a second. Okay, so if I go back here now, and I'm talking about page layouts, so I'm going to now go to our Sarah Science record, and then I'm going to go ahead, highlight over here, and I'm going to go to this Master Divinity application. So again, this is all in Lightning. So we talked about this earlier. So right now, they're in started app, and I've already set this up, but I want to highlight this. So they're using, in this case, ReaderX, which has its own set of fields to kind of show where it's at in the review process using our tool. You can notice right now, nothing shows related to ReaderX. There's no kind of section. But what they want is to make sure that when this person hits review, right, that dynamically that section can just populate, right? And so the way that that's accomplished is if I go up to the gear icon here and go to edit page, okay, this is going to take me to the Lightning page builder here. And so when this loads, once you enable what's called dynamic forms, you'll notice that this kind of page in the details section looks different. It has these kind of dotted lines around them, and you can kind of highlight these certain ones beyond just like your standard page layout. And what you'll also notice is you'll have a second tab up here called fields, where you can have field sections that you drag on, as well as all the fields related, in this case, to the application. And what's nice about this, if you missed our first session or haven't used this yet, is so traditional page layouts are governed by profile or record type. And especially in the case of like an application, typically it doesn't have a record type. And so this gives you a lot more granular control of what can show, because like historically you couldn't use a value like emission status as an example to hide or show something, right? So here, what I'm able to do is I can scroll down, and what you'll see here is if I go down to the review fields, right, there's this little eye icon. So if I click on that, this indicates what the visibility level is. And so what the visibility level of this is that if a record admission status equals review, then go ahead and show this. Now, if I wanted to add additional things like review or, admitted or submitted app or whatever it might be, I could do that. But before, right, I could only do it based on like a page layout, record type, profile. But here I can actually use another value on the application to show this whole section. And so because I have this in place, what this looks like is right now, let me actually just go back. Right now, if I look at this record, I have, as we saw, right, we didn't have that status in place. So now or that section in place, if I move this to review and update that. So let's just give us a minute. I'm going to go ahead and close some of these so you can see. It was down at the bottom here. But now you see that review field section, which was previously hidden, now shows. And the nice thing about this can show for anything. So especially like, within most like Enrollment RX workflows, when a contact is created, it gets that initial inquiry app that's kind of created alongside of it. If you wanted just to hide some of this extra stuff for just inquiry apps and just really simplify this, that's where something like that dynamic forms that I just showed you in the editing can really come into play. So it's really a handy tool, I would say, to kind of hide and show things dynamically. And again, that works on a field level too. So going back to that social security example, if you wanted just to hide that field by itself, again, that has to be available for the contact object, but let's say that was on the custom object here, you'd be able to hide and filter based on just a field as well, not just a section. So just wanted to highlight that. And then the next kind of scenario that I wanted to talk about before we get to some Q&A here at the end, we'll just get back to where I was. So let's just get back to where I was real quick. Is going to be related to restriction rules. So we talked about restriction rules a little bit earlier. So as the VP of admissions wants to make sure all the traditional recruiters can see only tasks that they own. So in this example, right, like a recruiter needs access to a task object. You can't just hide that, right? Like they need that object level permission. In addition to that, it's not really something you could silo easily through like making those private and sharing rules. It's kind of, I mean, that technically I guess could be done, but that gets a little tricky. But this might be a good scenario now where what's called a restriction rule can be put in place. So how could this be accomplished, right? So the way that this can be accomplished, here, is again, you're going to go to our setup here. So I'm going to go to setup. And the way I set up a restriction rule is actually at the object level. So in this case, we're talking about object manager. These are all your objects. And the object in question here in our example is what's called a task in Salesforce, which is the standard kind of task object. I'm going to go to the task object. And you'll see an option here towards the bottom that says restriction rules. So I'm going to click on restriction rule. And I've already set this one up, but let me edit it so I can kind of show you the concept behind this. So the restriction rule that's set up here, and the rule detail is that they can only see their own tasks. So the first thing you need to do with the user criteria is to set up what users this restriction applies to. So in this case, the user criteria is that the profile ID equals this profile, because in this example, we only want a specific profile to be highlighted. So it gets a little technical here where you actually have to grab an ID. You can't just look it up in a restriction rule. And if you haven't done that before, this is just a general tip in Salesforce overall, although it's a little easier in Classic. But if I go to my setup menu and I go to profiles, if I click on a particular profile record, so I think in this case, it was like the recruitment one. What it does in the URL up here is it actually populates the ID of the record that we need to grab. So if you're wondering how can I grab a profile ID, that's how you do it. You go to the actual record, same with like if you were on like an application or something, the ID actually is in the URL itself. And that's how you can identify that. So in this example that we set up here, we just grab that ID. So basically the criteria is that if it's a recruitment profile, what should we then do? So the record criteria in this case is that the record field of owner ID of the task equals the current user ID. So if I'm logged in as a recruiter in this recruitment profile, I can only see tasks that I own, is basically what this is saying. And there's other scenarios where this can apply. Salesforce Help actually has a bunch of different scenarios that we can link to in the deck that you can walk through. But essentially what this restriction rule is now doing is that, again, you don't want to hide tasks from your recruiters, But in this scenario, maybe they should only ever see their own. And so what this would do is then add that restriction rule to add that additional filter in that use case. So again, highly recommend you check out restriction rules. Again, don't just add one of these in production and hit, oh, all right, we're good to go. Test, always test in a sandbox and things of that nature. But that's essentially the concept behind a restriction rule. So before we get to Q&A here, just a few more things I wanted to just talk about is just essentially some best practices as it relates to data governance, and I'll let Paul kind of chime in here as well at the end. But earlier we showed those organizational wide defaults, and you never want to just go in and just mass calculate, especially if you have lots and lots of records in your system. You don't want to just go in and just flip the switch and be like, oh, everything's good now, and change those org-wide defaults. Like if you're not live yet, that's one thing, but if you're live in production, that's something you definitely want to test in the sandbox, anticipate some downtime. Depending on how many records you have, you might even need to engage with Salesforce support and some assistance there. So just that's something definitely to be aware of, especially if you're dealing with something like a contact object, because that has major implications in your system. So as I mentioned, test in sandbox. And also, as we talked about, I would make it a point that if you, as an admin, have not spent time really thinking about your role hierarchy, make that a to-do item this summer, because not only does it control the kind of record sharing, and perhaps that's not an issue, right? Everybody can see everything type of thing in your org, but it also has other impacts, such as the concept of reporting on my team. So, if you were building a report that says, show me all open tasks on my team, that my team is a built-in functionality filter within Salesforce reports that relies on that role hierarchy as well. And that also comes with other sharing mechanisms, such as sharing certain access to certain reports and dashboards, also is controlled by role hierarchy. So it's not just record access, although that's important, but it also has other downstream impacts. So definitely is something I would highlight. There is the ability to share records across, to different profiles and roles, but there's this concept of creating a public group that is also pretty helpful, because with a public group, you can kind of pull from different users, roles, or profiles into one group, kind of, we'll say straddle kind of the line on multiple ones of those, and then share to that group, right? So you're not having to build necessarily like 10 sharing rules. You can just build one just to a public group and have those different type of users defined in that. So that is definitely a helpful tool. So if you were just to go your setup and go to groups, you could create a public group and you can kind of see the UI there. And then the other big one I would say is a data skew. So in Salesforce, data skew occurs when more than 10,000 child object records are related to a single parent, or more than 10,000 records of any object are owned by a single Salesforce user. And what this can really do is it can impact the overall processing of your data, any like major transactions, and it can cause a lot of downstream impact. So that's something definitely to be aware of. Like, for example, I hope this never happens, but for some reason, if you had like, I don't know, 50,000 contacts under one account record, there's lots of problems with that, but that could cause tons of issues, right? And so that's just something to be aware of, is that when you have this overweighted over ownership of certain records or relationships, data skew can be a big issue. But Paul, I don't know if there's anything else you want to chime in there as well.
The only other thing that I can think of is probably like taking a look at your data capacity. So Salesforce does have a storage limit, and records and documents take a toll against that limit. So keeping in mind things about like purging old records or moving old records to storage servers, or purging unnecessary records that are just piling up in the system. Like I know Enrollment or Form Builder RX specifically has an object called portal package loggers that if there's any issues or errors, it'll create records. So you just want to keep an eye on where is most of your data storage going to, just so that you can always keep a healthy, clean org in your environment.
Yeah, that's a great point, Paul. And if you're not sure where that lives, if you go to your company information or if you go set up in data storage, you'll be able to see those things. All right, with that, Paul, are there any Q&As that we want to
only
touch on?
one so far, which I've responded to. I typed an answer, but I'll read it out loud anyways, just because it could apply to others that are listening. Eric asked if there is a ability to control for a student recruiter. Is there an ability to control which admission status values can be selected by that student recruiter? And I did respond. Typically, an application object in a typical implementation doesn't leverage the record type, which it can. It's just not a typical use. But if you were using record types for the application object, you would be able to control which pick list values are available at a profile level. That's one option to go down if record types are leveraged. An alternative option, which doesn't limit which pick list values for the admission status are visible to the student, is the validation rule. You can create a validation rule that only applies to the student recruiter profile. And if they attempt to update the admission status to a value outside of their defined options, it'll throw an error and prevent them from saving that record in an update. The other alternative that I wrote down was that you can always use Form Builder to create a Salesforce platform environments for internal use. And with that, you can create forms that are intended for the student recruiter, where you have just the fields that you want them to see, or just the fields you want them to update. And with the power of Page Builder, you can control which pick list values are visible on that form. And the fourth option that I threw down was the use of flows. So when you're building flows, you do have the ability to create a screen flow. And within that screen flow, you can limit what choices a student recruiter can make during that process of the screen flow.
All right, great. Thanks, Paul.
And we got another question here that I'm just now looking at. Give me 1 second here. So this is talking about custom permissions. And that's in relation to dynamic forms. Matt, do you have any insight on how those can be used?
Yeah, I'm not sure as much with custom permissions. I haven't used that quite as much, Shamir, but we can follow up with you on that. I know what you're talking about, because when you're on that, I'll just exit here real quick. When you're on that page kind of layout configuration, and if I were back on this and I edit this, what Shamir is referring to is that if I go to so slow too, the details of a particular record. So let's say it's requirements. And I want to set component visibility. There is, I think, a record field, device, and advance. I think there's some things related to that for dynamic forms. I'm trying to remember. And I think it's under advance. So here, I think it's under permissions. And then here, there's a standard permission and custom permission. And then some of these really kind of out of the box. So there's some that might come out of the box like that. Like I think there's one that Mowgli, for example, has provided here. None that I think ERX has created, but essentially custom permissions can be referenced from here. So I haven't used those personally as much, but that's something we can follow up with you on. That's a good question.
And if there are any other questions, feel free to drop them in. No questions too big or too small. We can at least look at them.
Absolutely. And we can circle back. Just wrapping up here. So as you know, we have our RAD Navigator, which has tons of information related to our products. This is where we also post our videos afterwards. So if you need to access that, certainly reach out to us if you don't have access. And before we conclude, just a reminder too, we don't have a slide for it, but we do have our Building on the Best conference just around the corner. And so if you have not signed up for that, please do. We're going to have a lot of exciting sessions, a lot of just really good content, and some things that are really going to help your institution. So hope to see you there as well. But in the meantime, thank you very much for attending today. Thank you, Paul, for your insights as well. And please, if you can just take a moment when this ends to fill out that survey, that's super helpful for us, or fill it out when it gets emailed. That would be great as well. But with that, we'll kind of wrap up today's session. And thanks everybody for attending. Have a great day.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.